So, this is my presentation on controversy and, more importantly, how controversy and Indigenous studies as a core curriculum course and elective course mingle in Saskatchewan education. So, what is Indigenous studies? Well, Indigenous studies is an interdisciplinary focus on Indigenous people's culture and histories worldwide. It's a sub-discipline of the social sciences. It has its roots in the profound implications of colonialism throughout the world. So, not just in Canada or the United States, but Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria, Kenya, um, several African countries, South America, basically anywhere Spain, France, England, wherever had been colonized and subjected the indigenous people to colonialism. We see symmetrical issues in these nations. So, Indigenous studies was introduced in Canada for the first time by Trent University in 1969. Um, that's interesting because Trent University had only been established in 1964, so it was only 5 years new. It was still in its infancy at the time. It took a leap of faith with Indigenous studies by introducing it. Now, courses in Native studies were initially integrated with fields like anthropology or sociology, focusing on core issues in Indigenous studies. It wasn't its own field. It wasn't its own class or course. It was topics associated with those other programs. However, Native studies marked a shift in academia towards inclusivity and accessibility, eventually being eventually being adopted by prestigious institutions like the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Alberta. So while Trent University is the one that took the leap of faith, the course quickly gained traction for a plethora of reasons, and then long-established institutions like the University of Sask and the University of Alberta had picked it up. So prior to the 60s, when Trent University was established, universities were considered ivory towers, right? They were considered places only for the wealthy, only for the elite, the affluent, the affable. Um, and it was very unlikely that a common lower middle class citizen would be able to achieve higher education. However, that changed in the 60s. And with a larger audience and a larger selection of students came a more diverse need for came a bigger need for diversity in courses and degrees offered. As I said, Native studies gained traction, was introduced to established institutions. However, initially concerns arose about white instructors teaching Indigenous studies, and what had happened is a representative from the Saskatchewan Federation of Indians had come forward and said, and I quote, "For too long, non-Indians have been speaking for Indians, especially in universities. And while we seek continued cooperation with white society, it must just be that cooperation, not assimilation." And because these courses were being taught by white people, they were taught by white scholars who initially introduced the course to solve the native problem, right? To solve that core issue at the time that white people saw with native people, but not just in Canada, but within the United States and Australia and so on and so forth. So it wasn't uh, it wasn't the course it is now of teaching a wider population about the Indigenous histories and implications of colonialism in Canada. It was more so to solve that native problem. So here are the challenges faced by Indigenous people in Indigenous studies courses, particularly, right? So there's that concern about white people speaking for us, like which has been a core issue for 500 years, 600 years. Um, it just comes down to the fact of the matter of just let us hold the pen, let us teach our histories. You have to have a certain grain of salt when you talk about Indigenous histories. especially from a white perspective, because everything that has been written about our history in Canada, especially when it comes to Native history, and when this is how the social science of history is kept, is just written records and so on and so forth. But you have to remember that everything written about Indigenous history 500, 400, 300 years ago was written by some French explorer, some white French explorer, and their interpretation of what happened, right? There is no written history from Indigenous people from that time because our history was oral. So my recommendation is wherever, whenever possible, Native studies, Indigenous studies courses need to be taught by Indigenous people with real lived experiences, with real connections in their community, with real knowledge of the core issues that Indigenous people face, so they can teach the content that the curriculum wants them to teach regarding Native studies and do it justice and bring that passion and that drive that every educator should bring to their courses. But it's increasingly important because of the complex curriculum issue. Achieving equitable methods of delivering Indigenous content is increasingly complex. Now, if you look at the Saskatchewan curriculum document, it says initially it says two things about the goal of Native studies. It says initially it says help all students develop their knowledge, positive attitudes, and cultural understanding about First Nations and Métis and Inuit people. Right now, think about that. That's not a course meant to be taught to Indigenous people. How are you going to teach Indigenous people about their about their culture, about their history? Right? It doesn't make sense, especially when you have a white person teaching this course. How is a white person going to tell a Native person, or how is a white person going to tell an Indigenous person about their histories, about the issues they face? It just doesn't really make sense, right? So that's why there's that strong recommendation for me to have Indigenous people teach these courses. It's if you look at it from face value, from what the Saskatchewan curriculum document wants, that's not a course designed for Indigenous people to take. However, when you get further along in the document, it says the intention and goal of developing this document is to address the needs of a diverse student population and to make education more equitable for Indigenous students. So, what is the goal? Is the goal to teach and develop understanding about Indigenous culture and histories, or is it to achieve the diverse needs of the needs of a diverse student population? Right. I find it incredibly difficult to achieve both in the same course. Right. So I think the Saskatchewan government and the Saskatchewan curriculum developers need to decide which goal are they going for. And in the development, concern over non-Indian speaking for Indigenous people in curriculum development, if the goal is to address the diverse need of students, then there needs to be diversity in curriculum development, right? There needs to be input from Indigenous scholars and Indigenous historians, Indigenous teachers, Indigenous professors, right? It can't just be white people creating this course, because then you have what I mentioned earlier, white people speaking for Indigenous people, and Native studies, Indigenous studies stops being just that and turns into a white person's study of natives. Thank you.